It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's truly my honor to introduce Sarah Koenig as a 2019 Media Justice Trailblazer. 5 years ago, Sarah and I started making cereal from the basement of Sarah's house, which meant like blankets and pillows thrown all around to try and muffle the noise, and pausing recording when her kids would flush the toilet upstairs. And for us, like, that was kind of the beauty of doing a podcast, because we sort of figured, who listens to podcasts, you know? Nobody was listening to podcasts. We felt like it was absolutely no pressure at all. When we first started, we were gonna release the first season of Serial. Our plan was that we thought if we could get 300,000 downloads for an episode, we would be really happy with that. 300,000 would be a totally respectable number. And what ended up happening is that we did reach 300,000 downloads 5 days after we launched the show. And within about 6 weeks, we had more than 5 million downloads on iTunes, which was the fastest that had ever happened. And then after that, we just kind of started breaking records all over the place. As of now, it's been 3 seasons later. We've had more than 420 million downloads of the 3 seasons of Serial. I know. We've been told that Serial was downloaded in every country in the world except for North Korea and Eritrea, which leads us to be like, I don't know what Eritrea's problem is, but anyway, I'm going to tell you guys all of this because I want to give you the sense of scale, basically. I want you to, and I want to brag, but other than that, I want to give you a sense of scale of why Sarah is being honored here tonight, for the enormous impact that she has had on the general public's understanding of the criminal justice system. Its successes and strengths, but also more importantly and more potently, its weaknesses, its failures, and its need for reform. Sarah began her career as a newspaper reporter, kind of a just the facts kind of endeavor. She covered local news and politics and the courts, beginning at her home newspaper on Long Island, and then she at the Concord Monitor and the Baltimore Sun. She started freelance stories for the public radio show This American Life, and then came on full-time as a producer and reporter, and that was how she and I met, and we started working together. The nature of our relationship is basically like I'm the editor to Sarah's reporter, and it's been probably one of the most fulfilling relationships I've had in my entire life. Sarah is exceptionally thorough. She's heroically dogged. She's a model for careful, responsible reporting. And also, and I feel totally confident saying this, she's one of the finest, most gifted writers working in broadcast media today. She's actually probably one of the best that's ever done it. I think sometimes it gets overlooked when people try and assess, you know, like, why Serial? Why did Serial become such a success? Like, why is it connected with such a large audience? And there are factors that go into it. It's like the subject matter and the storytelling and the production and, you know, surprising and thoughtful interviews. All of those things are true, and we work hard at them. But really, if you really pay attention to Serial, you'll see what sets Serial apart is really Sarah's writing. She's an amazing writer, and it's what makes the series better than anybody else's. Serial's first season was about a murder case in Baltimore, and as soon as it aired, listeners began to ask Sarah and the rest of the Serial team, what does that case, the murder conviction of Adnan Syed, what does that case tell us about the criminal justice system? Which was a totally fair question. But it was also one we'd sometimes stumble over, because we knew the answer was that that case was not like the ones that were filling America's courthouses. They weren't in America's courtrooms every day. Nothing about the Syed case was typical. A defendant with no criminal record, a private defense attorney, a 6-week trial. The fact that there was a trial at all, non-Syed cases are not what's filling America's courtrooms. And Sarah knew that in order to truly understand the American criminal justice system and to understand why so many people working in it and living in it say that it's broken, she'd need to look not at one extraordinary case, but instead at its opposite, which was ordinary cases. For the most recent season of Serial, Sarah and our colleague Emmanuel Jochi spent more than a year in Cleveland's criminal courthouse, watching the unflashy cases that reporters don't usually pause over, like marijuana possession, assault, disorderly conduct. The series didn't include any trials. There was no surprise testimony. There were no smoking guns, no rousing closing statements. Instead, through gripping, emotional, and often like rage-inducing interconnected stories, Sarah and Emmanuel exposed the racially inflected machinery of a system that was built for plea bargains. More than 8 million people have listened so far to each episode of this past season of Serial. 8 million. With her extraordinary talent, Sarah brought awareness for needed reforms to one of our most important democratic institutions. And she documented something that's difficult for reporters to capture engagingly: what justice means for people in the criminal justice system. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the 2019 Justice Media Trailblazer, Sarah Koenig.
Before I say anything else, I want to make it super clear, I do nothing by myself. Every single thing I make that you've ever heard is a total collaboration and principally is shaped by Julie Snyder. I make nothing by myself. I am a figurehead up here. That said, I am very happy to be here, and I feel lucky to be here and really very humbled to be here with Brittany Packnett and with everybody here. A trailblazer, I suppose, should also feel powerful, like a Chevy SUV. I looked up the word trailblazer the other day to make double sure I knew what it meant. I already knew what the word trailblazer meant. But looking it up was a procrastination from writing these remarks, and writing these remarks, in fact, was also a procrastination from doing some research on a case that I'm looking into. The case is from here in New York. It happened in Harlem. A young man shot and killed 2 police officers as he was being led into the police station at West 135th Street for questioning. And not insignificant to the case, the defendant was black, the officers white. The guy's defense at trial was essentially a PTSD defense, that he'd been traumatized by cops for years, and he went into a panic at the thought of being hurt by them again. And he said he actually couldn't remember exactly even what he'd done or how many shots he'd fired. All he knew was that he was scared. He said for years, anytime a crime went down in his neighborhood, he'd be accosted by detectives, and they'd beaten him a handful of times to the point where he'd had to take to his bed. As I said, the case went to trial, and during closing arguments, the defense attorney recounted all the times his client had been roughed up by the cops in an effort to get the guy to confess to crimes he'd committed or had not committed, or to get him to inform on other people. They did not succeed in either, his lawyer told the jury. But they did create in his mind a horror and fear of the police, which meant physical agonies and torture of the human soul. I do not desire to indulge in an attack on the police department, the lawyer said. In its rank and file, the police force has men who are willing to give the best that is in them to the service of the people of the city. But I cannot understand why some men, immediately on donning a police uniform, become instruments of horror and cruel methods. I challenge the district attorney to deny that there have come to him reports that policemen have beaten persons in order to obtain information. If the police cannot detect crime except by unlawful methods, then woe to the city of New York, for the people's rights are being crushed to the ground, unquote. The lawyer who made that speech is my grandfather, actually. That's how I came upon this case. I know, he was good. I've been looking into his old trials, and I came upon this one. And the year that this one happened was 1922, almost 100 years ago. And I gotta say, I was struck reading about this case, how familiar it sounded. apart from the use of the word persons, someone could be giving this speech to a jury or a judge in a courtroom right now, today, in Manhattan or Cleveland or Baltimore. To borrow a sentence from my grandfather, I do not desire to indulge in an attack on the police department. That is not my point. My point is that very little of what we see in the news is new. Just check out the rest of the front page of the New York Times from that day in 1922 when my grandfather made his closing argument to that jury. In Albany, a report documenting waste, mismanagement, favoritism, and profiteering in a government agency. Here in New York City, an affordable housing crisis because, quote, builders generally are turning to the construction of expensive dwellings as affording a better return on their money. In Washington, D.C., House members met with lobbyists to talk about a bill regulating immigration. In Poughkeepsie, attempted sexual assaults on women at Vassar College. I swear on my Chevy Trailblazer, I am not trying to depress you. I know our society is better and fairer in 1,000 ways than it was in 1922 for all kinds of people. It's just that when it comes to criminal justice, I get confused sometimes about what progress looks like. Consider 1922, New York City was safer than it is today. In 1922, relatively fewer people were locked up, and the people who were locked up spent less time in prison than they would today. Also, more trials happened in 1922 than they do today, and more people were acquitted at those trials. And believe it or not, in a bunch of ways, the criminal justice system was less discriminatory in 1922 than it is today. So, New York City, 1922, less crime and less punishment. I'm not standing here today to say it was better in the olden times. All sorts of outrages were at play in New York a century ago. I could list them, but you already know what they are. Because, and here's what I am going to stand here and say to you today, because for 100 years, we reporters have reported the same stories of injustice, the same stories of crime and punishment. We've all held up the same beautiful concept of fairness, and we've all demonstrated the same inability to agree on what it means or who it's for. I more or less understand how we got here. I understand how certain pernicious situations persist. What I don't understand, and what I've spent a lot of my career excavating my way through criminal cases to try to understand, is how situations change. What constellation of empirical and emotional factors can unglue the status quo? What mix of ingredients can wash away a hardened rut? I was listening to the radio the other day about how Colin Kaepernick settled with the NFL, and they had this sociologist on from UC Berkeley to talk about it, Professor Harry Edwards, and he was saying, yeah, now was a good time for Kaepernick to settle because the movement was in decline. He said these types of movements, they last about 6 years. He was so definite about it, 6 years. Black Power movement, he said, 1966 to 72. This one, 2012, Miami Heat and LeBron put on hoodies. About 6 years later, right on time, Kaepernick settles with the NFL. Professor Edwards said that if you go much longer than that, without policies, without programs, without progress, then you just are getting in a cycle of protesting. Then you're just drama. And it made me wonder, am I in the drama business? Do I broadcast drama so that someone else might use it to make progress? And if so, when is my 6 years up? I say to people all the time, I am not an advocate. I am not on anyone's side. It's the journalist's cliche. I'm just after the truth. I'm just trying to inform the public. But in our heart of hearts, in my heart of hearts, I know that that is not the whole story and that I am not alone. I think all serious-minded criminal justice reporters are stealth reformers trying to change their own beat. Because what is the point of the truth? What is the point of information if it's not feeding progress? New Yorkers knew back in 1922 that cops were beating the daylights out of suspects, especially black suspects, in the back rooms of their station houses. New Yorkers know today that black people and other people of color are disproportionately abused by the criminal justice system at every turn. We know this. Knowledge is not our problem. Fixing it is our problem. I sometimes flirt with despair over the fixing, but that's where Brittany Packnett comes in. She is trailblazing the bejesus out of all kinds of messes, ancient and modern. She is figuring out how we gather in our arms centuries of blood-soaked past and make them matter to an information-soaked present. In that regard, at least our work overlaps. We are both trying to claw our way into people's consciousness, to make them care without unduly bumming them out. The thing that I fear most in our country is the death of certain principles, ordinary principles: honesty, freedom, tolerance, equality. When I was young, I thought that they were solids, like columns of stone at the Lincoln Memorial, a site that, as it happens, opened for business in 1922. Now I know how ephemeral these principles are. They're more like holograms that exist only insofar as we're able to imagine them and remember them and protect them. John Jay's mission is to educate fierce advocates for justice. And I especially love that the word fierce is in there, because that's what it's going to take: ferocity. Maybe some of you students here are going to try those other professions: attorney, politician, academic, police officer. I personally would like every single one of you to become a reporter. But regardless, lasting progress in the realm of criminal justice will require ferocious accuracy, ferocious persistence, ferocious kindness. If you haven't already gathered, I'm not hugely optimistic when it comes to this stuff. But right now I have to say, standing in a room with Ms. Packnett and with all of you fierce advocates for justice, I do feel hopeful. And my hope is that 100 years from now, in the year 2119, when my granddaughter listens to one of my criminal justice stories, she won't think, sounds familiar. She'll think, what the hell is she talking about? Thank you very, very much.